All that's left is bringing on this text and the divider line. And that's something we did early on and we're just now coming to, but that's all right. What I'm gonna do first is just jump into one of these divider lines and we'll add a trim paths to it. So I'll go into the divider shape layer and add a trim paths. And that's off screen for me, but you know where it is. And we'll just animate this line like we have in the past. So we'll set a keyframe at 0% on the end, move forward maybe about 21 frames, I'm not sure. We can always adjust the timing later. Just ease these keyframes and go into our graph editor to adjust those influence handles. Something like that, play that back. Now we've got a line coming out. That's gonna be repeated across all of our divider lines. We probably want them to come in right about here where the standings are. So let's select all of those and we'll choose a unique color for these. Let's say aqua, move these to that point in time and then offset each one by 2 frames. So deselect the first one, shift the rest forward 2 frames, and repeat that process all down the line. So those come out very nicely staggered, and it mimics what's happening with that progress bar. I like that a lot. Next, why don't we figure out how we want to bring on this text? Well, it could probably follow that same kind of motion that we have for the background element, because it's going to be coming in pretty quickly after the standings text. But again, I want to do this a little bit more intelligently. We looked at that transform effect to implement the skew onto the progress bar, but we can do the same thing for animation so that the keyframes of the transform properties don't restrict us from moving things around easily. Because remember, if I had position keyframes on this layer, then it's more difficult to reposition it without having to be mindful of those keyframes. So instead of adding keyframes to that, I'm just going to bring a transform effect onto this text layer. And why don't we just solo it so we can stay focused on it, and I'll go to the start of it. And I'm gonna use the position property on this transform effect to move the text around. Now, something I like to do a lot with the transform effect is just zero out all of these values. And that just gives us that baseline 0 starting point, which I really like. So I'm gonna change the anchor point to 0 and 0 on the X and the Y. That moves the text way out of sight all the way down here. But if I also change the position to 0, 0, then it's right back where it started. So long as the position and anchor point are the same number, then it's not gonna shift the layer around at all. Now what I can do is set a position keyframe, press U to bring up that keyframe and move it forward in time a bit, and then move it down and then a little bit to the left. I'm not exactly sure how far to the left, so why don't we bring the standings box back? And actually I'm gonna need to move forward in time to be able to see that, so why don't we just shift this text layer forward too? But I want it to kind of move in the same angle. So that's a little extreme. Maybe we go about -8 pixels and have it just slide up into place. I'll ease that keyframe and influence the handles so that it just snaps into place. Now, another thing I'd like to do is add a little bit of a flicker as it comes in. So it's not just appearing and sliding in, and also not just fading in. So if I were to add an opacity keyframe, again, I can do this through the transform effect, right in line with the position, and press U a couple times so we can see both keyframes. And then go back to the beginning and turn it down to 0. That's gonna fade up nicely, but it's actually really simple to make this feel a little bit more techy and add in a little bit of a glitch using a flicker. And there are no real rules with this, but all we need to do is basically go forward a frame, and I can use the page down key to do that. Page up goes back 1 frame, page down goes forward 1 frame, or the controller command key and the left and right arrows. And basically just set this to a random opacity value. So we don't need to start at 0, maybe we start it at something brighter, so around 75%, and then we'll turn it down to a lower value. Then we'll go forward another frame, increase it to a brighter value, another frame forward and drop it down, and just do this back and forth 2 or 3 times, and then just let it fade up over a few frames. So maybe I'll ease into that last keyframe, but watch what happens when I play this back now. It's going to flicker on and fade up. It's a really cool effect and not that difficult to do. So just play around with the different values and seeing how the different opacity levels will affect the flicker. You could even space some of the keyframes out a little bit. And once you're happy with it, we can actually copy this entire animation over to all of the other text layers. I'll just unsolo these 2 just by copying the effect. So let me copy that and select these other text layers so we can move them all to the same point in time with the left square bracket, and then paste. Now that animation is applied to every text layer, and I just need to work on the timing. So I want them to pop up just before the divider lines come out. So I'll back them up here, and then one at a time, just shift them forward 2 frames. Actually, it looks like I missed one of the frames here, so I'm gonna move that forward. Deselect those 3 and just offset each one of these 2 frames at a time. So the text layers will come out before the dividing lines, and they'll have this really cool staggered flicker effect. And I think that's looking fantastic. We're really adding a lot of complexity, but keeping it all very controllable and adjustable. Now, I think I'd like to make that background a little bit more transparent. It's completely opaque right now, but if I go into that standings box, so this container right here, and just turn down the opacity a little bit, then we're gonna see through to the footage in the background, and that looks pretty cool. Maybe we'll set that at maybe 85% opacity. And we could even add some more depth to it by maybe adding a drop shadow. So let's grab the drop shadow effect, apply it to the rectangle, and maybe increase the distance as well as the softness, and maybe make it a similar color to the actual box. So it's a more tinted blue shadow. Just play around with that a little bit, maybe increase the angles so that it's going a little bit further down. I could add a similar drop shadow to the standings box. If I copy the drop shadow from this box and select the text box, I'll zoom in and paste it. So that way we're seeing a drop shadow there as well. And why don't we add some more texture to this as well using 2 more effects. So I'm gonna search for Venetian blinds again, same one we used to create the dashes on this rectangle. Apply that to the background, change that completion to 50%, but this time I wanna change the direction to 90 degrees. So these are kind of like scan lines. I'll change the width down so they're much tighter. The issue is that it's removing a lot of the layer. We're getting a lot of opacity here, and it's even cutting out the drop shadow. So I'm gonna move the drop shadow down in the effects stack so that it's applied after the Venetian blinds, but I need to put another effect between these 2 to bring some opacity back in between those bars. And that effect is called CC Composite. I'm gonna click and drag that effect between the Venetian blinds and drop shadow. And what this effect does is it recomposites the original layer before any effects were applied back onto it. And it doesn't look like that's happening because this checkbox right here, RGB only, that means it's ignoring the alpha channel and preserving all of the alpha that's already there. I wanna uncheck that, and we're back to where we started before we had any effects. That's okay, but I'd like to drop the opacity of that composited version of the layer a bit so that I can still see some of the texture. So maybe we'll set that to say 80%, and now we have just a little bit of those scanline textures in the background of that box that gives it a little bit more dimension. I think the last thing I want to do is just maybe increase the saturation of that fill color so it adds a little bit more vibrance behind everything and kind of fits the bright, colorful feel of the rest of this graphics package. I'm gonna fit this up to 100% so I can see it in context of the comp, and I think that this is just a little bit too tight. So what I wanna do is resize this background container, just make it a little bit taller. And what I wanna do is grab this standings box as well as all the checkpoint markers. And because all the others are parented to this one, I can just select those 2 things, and I'm just gonna shift this up a little bit. And then finally, to just cap this off a little and separate it from the rest of the stats, I'm gonna duplicate this divider 1, drag it down below the text, and we'll just rename this divider 0 for consistency, and then just click and drag this up and hold Control to snap it right on that bar. So I'll zoom in here to make sure that we're actually aligning it where we need to. There we go. And now we have it divided from the rest of the graphics. So I'm gonna maximize this comp. You can do that just by hovering your mouse over any panel and pressing the tilde key. That's the little squiggly line underneath the escape key in the top left corner of your keyboard. And let's just play this back. I think that really came together nicely, and it has a lot of dimension, a lot of really nice looking graphics that feel really complex, but are totally adjustable and built in a really intelligent way. Even though this graphic is completely different than the previous two, it still feels like it's part of the same package because we carried over that design language that really brings it all together. And making it easy to edit and customizable is something that every motion designer should be doing, at least the good motion designers. So set yourself up for success now by thinking through the design and how you're building it so that later on in the process, if you need to change something about it, it's not a big deal. And don't forget to download the assignment PDF so you can try this out for yourself. Now we get to take a look at easily one of the most rewarding processes in After Effects, 3D camera tracking. It looks and sounds a little bit complicated, but once you understand the basic workflow, it's really not that hard to do, and it's really straightforward. So let's take a look. I'm back here in Premiere looking at these clips that I grabbed from Adobe Stock, and what I like to do next is track some graphics into a shot. The tracker tools inside of After Effects are really great and easy to use, but you can definitely set yourself up for success by being selective with the clips that you choose to track. These first 4 clips in the front here, they're all drone shots. They're very wide and not a lot is happening in the scene. It's more of the camera moving dramatically through it. These are all going to work extremely well for tracking and inserting graphics into. Some of these other shots with the kite surfers are a lot busier, and there's not as much useful information in these shots to be able to track. The other thing to look out for is things that pass in front of the camera. If something completely obscures your view, imagine a bird flying in front of the camera here, that's gonna just completely confuse the tracker. It's not gonna know what it's looking at because to the tracker, it's just a whole bunch of pixels that it's analyzing, and something passing in front of the camera is going to completely disrupt that calculation. So be aware that if you need to track something that's more complex, like say a busy city street with buses and people moving around, that's going to be a big challenge and require a lot more effort in order to get a successful track. But shots like these first 4 are really, really great examples for using the camera tracker, and I particularly like this drone shot because the camera's swooping around this outlook. It's a very dynamic shot, and I think we can do some pretty cool stuff with it. So that's the clip I'm going to use. And remember, going from Premiere to After Effects is really easy. I'm just going to copy this clip, jump into After Effects, make a new comp, and 1920 by 1080 works. The frame rate of those clips was 23.976. I'll just call this composition checkpoint 1 track and click OK. Now I can simply just paste and the clip will be inserted into my timeline. Now it puts it in the same place in time in this comp as it was in the timeline in Premiere. That's why it's all the way over here. So I'm just going to press the left square bracket to align it to the front of the comp. And then I want to make this comp the same length as the clip. So I'm just going to go to the out point of that layer, which I could do by clicking and dragging while holding shift on that playhead to snap to the out point, or I could just use the keyboard shortcut of O for out, I for in to jump to the in and out points of that layer. And to trim this comp's duration to that length, all I have to do is set the work area's out point to the same time. So N on the keyboard to set the out point, and then right click in my work area and say trim comp to work area. So I'll do that, and now my comp is the same length as this clip. Now the tracker we're going to use for this shot is called the 3D camera tracker. And the reason it's called 3D is because this actually is going to create 3D data that we can actually use After Effects 3D's tools and layers with. And to apply it, we're actually going to go to the effects panel. The 3D camera tracker is an effect that we apply to footage. So I'll just search for 3D camera tracker, and there it is. I'll apply it to the footage, and we're going to immediately get this banner that says that it's analyzing in the background, and this is the first of 2 steps. Over in the effects controls panel, we're going to see a progress. So this is actually analyzing every single frame of this clip. In this case, that's what I want, but I wanted to point that out because if you have a 5-minute clip, that's going to take forever to track, and you're probably never going to want to track something that long. So before applying that 3D camera tracker, make sure that you trim this layer to whatever portion of the clip that you actually want to track, and then trim the comp to the same length. So if I only needed the first 2 seconds of the clip, I would set my work area there, right click, trim comp to work area, and then apply the 3D camera tracker. Now it just completed, so it's solving the camera. That's the next step of the process where it takes all of that analyzed data and converts it into usable 3D data. And if I have that effect selected, we're actually going to get an error. And I knew this was going to happen, but I wanted to show it to you anyway. The error is that the 3D camera tracker's layer size must match the composition and use the default transform values. So what that means is this clip, as we can see, is larger than my comp because it was actually shot in 2K, 2048 by 1080 instead of 1920 by 1080. And the other thing that would cause this error is if I were to scale it down or rotate it or reposition it. It has to be in the center of the comp, unscaled, unrotated, and the comp has to be the same size. Now, fortunately, all that analyzation that it did, it's still there. I just need to come up to composition, go into composition settings, and change the width to be 2048. Now when I click OK, that warning banner is going to go away and we see all these colorful crosshairs all over our footage. These are all of the data points that the 3D camera tracker analyzed across the entire clip. So if I fit this to my comp and just scrub through here, you can see all of those points moving throughout the scene and kind of sticking to different points within the shot. And if I go back into my effect controls, there's a couple of settings here that could make these easier to see if they end up being really small in your track. If we look in the background here, some of these points are extremely hard to see. You can change the track point size right here, and that won't do anything to the data. It's just this overlay preview. So you can adjust that however you'd like. And then the next option is target size. That's what this red target is as I move my mouse around in here. Oops, I accidentally sent that down to 10%. But that target size, if that ever becomes too small, same thing. I can increase that here and now it's going to be much larger. But let's talk about what this actually is. What are the points and what are the target sizes? Well, like I said, all these points are the spots that the tracker was able to identify and then track across the scene. So if we just take a look at this one right here and scrub forward and backward, you see that it's sticking to the side of that platform. And if we move forward in time, there's points that are sticking to the roof. This is what's making our shot trackable. The target is going to be where we set what's called a ground plane. And this really can be anywhere in your scene, but it generally makes sense to choose something that's a floor, which is why it's called a ground plane. So if I move my mouse around this area of the shot, so right inside that platform, that target kind of looks like it's aligned to the floor, but it's not quite perfect. What I can do is click on one of these points that's on the floor and then shift click on another one and then another one and maybe even another one. And now that target really does look like it's aligned to that plane. And I can continue clicking other points to make this a little bit more precise. I don't want to grab something that exists on another plane like the railing or the face of these spindles, and definitely not the roof because that's going to throw off the perspective. But if I shift click to remove that selection, it'll go away again. You can also click and drag like the lasso tool in Photoshop to be able to select these points if that's easier for you. But once you have a good selection and it looks like the target is aligned to the plane, you can also click and drag this to move it around and find kind of a center point. So let's say that this is where I want the center of my floor to be. What I'll do next is right click on the target and go down to this option, Set Ground Plane and Origin. And when I click that, nothing changes, but what it's done is aligned all of this tracking data to that target point being the center of the entire scene. And that just makes the rest of this process a little bit easier to work with. Let's say that I wanted to put some text right on top of this platform. Well, since my target is already there, I'm just going to right click on it again and go to the first option, Create Text and Camera. And when I click on that, I suddenly have a text layer that looks like it's laying kind of flat on that ground. And down in my layers, I also have a 3D tracker camera. This is a new type of layer. We haven't looked at it yet. The icon for it is a little movie camera. This is what a 3D camera layer looks like in After Effects. And if I toggle my switches and modes, it's going to bring up these switches right here. This column is for 3D layers. And you'll notice that it's enabled for the text and we have a switch on for the camera as well. Now the camera itself has to be 3D. I can't disable that. The text, however, I could disable that, but then we're going to break the effect that we just created. So I'll undo and point out that my text layer has this new colorful thing overlaying it that looks very different from anything else we've seen in After Effects. This is usually referred to as a 3D gizmo, but it's basically what allows us to place, rotate, and scale 3D layers in After Effects. Now, After Effects is not a true 3D program, but it does have lots of 3D capabilities. So everything that we've worked with so far has been in 2 dimensions, just the X and the Y position. But now that we have a 3D camera in the scene and a 3D layer, we have access to the Z axis, allowing us to push things in and out of the scene. Now we can still use the properties panel to adjust this third dimension. It's just showing up as a third value over here. for all of these transform controls, and we now have X, Y, and Z rotation instead of just one rotation. But we have a new property right here called orientation. And this is very similar to rotation, but it needs to be thought of in a different way because it's kind of like the starting point or the neutral value for your layer's rotation. It's set to 270 on the X rotation, which is why this text is laying flat on the ground plane that we set. But if I change that to 0, then the text is going to be standing straight up, 90 degrees to that ground plane. So the way that I like to use orientation is to first just set up the rotation in the neutral position that I want it to be. So if I want it aligned to that deck, I'll just modify that Y value a few degrees so that it looks like it's kind of pointing in the right direction. And it's really big, so let me go to the character panel and just scale it down, and then maybe change this to an off-white color so it's easier to see in that scene. But I also want to point out we don't have to change things right here in the properties panel because of these gizmo controls. These red, blue, and green circles are the orientation for the X, Y, and Z axes. So if I clicked and dragged on the Y axis, I can rotate it interactively right here in the comp. Same thing for the other two handles. I could also grab these arrows and move the text around. So let's say that I wanted to align this to the roof of this platform. Well, I'm just clicking and dragging on that green arrow to reposition it on the Y axis. Now I'll just zoom out, fitting this to the comp, and press play and watch what happens. Like magic, that text is now in the scene. It is tracked, it looks like it's actually there, and there were so few steps to get to this point. This type of shot is ideal for the 3D camera tracker, and it did an excellent job of locking this in place. Now, obviously, it's not aligned to the center ridge line of this roof, but I can just go to a different angle, maybe about here, and then grab this Z position control and move it until it's aligned. Now that looks like it's even more locked in place right on top of that roof. Maybe I'll pull it forward just a little bit more. But because we set our ground plane and origin right in the center of that deck, it was very easy to align that text to my scene. But let's say that I wanted to add something else to my scene in a different location, and I didn't want to have to kind of reposition this from that starting point. Well, I can actually click on my footage again and just select that 3D camera tracker to bring up all of those points. What if I wanted to put something way in the background here with all of these bushes? Well, I can still do that. My ground plane and origin is still here, but if I select those points, maybe just drawing a lasso around a bunch of them, all of that data is relative to the ground plane and origin. So I can just right click on that target and say create text again, and it's going to make a new text layer positioned so that it aligns with those tracking points. So I can now select that text layer and then reorient it towards the camera so we can actually read it. So maybe I'll bring up the orientation to around 90 degrees on the Y, and I'll just grab these rotation controls and orient the text towards the camera. And now as I play through, you'll see that that text is locked in place in the background of this scene instead of where I set up the ground plane and origin. So you can very precisely add things to a shot like this very easily. If I just, again, select this camera tracker, I could grab a bunch more tracking points right here, add another text layer, maybe scale this one up and rotate it so that it's facing the camera. Maybe even lift this one up a little bit in the sky. And now I have 3 3D text layers all tracked into my shot in different locations, all looking like they were actually there when the camera was rolling.